Thank you so much for coming and sharing your testimony with us. So this time we just wanted to kind of just engage in conversation with you. Not many people here know yet that we are just beginning an outreach ministry. We have talked about this a little bit. For those of you who don't know, we are starting a ministry out of our Moms on Mission ministry that we have called a Rad Mom. And this is really just a radical motherhood outreach is what we are doing, promoting the sanctity of life in our communities. And there are three aspects of that. Motherhood hospitality, that's just really meeting the needs of the mothers in our communities. Two, sidewalk engagement, and this is something that we would go to women's marches and abortion clinics and really engage and talk to these women and share the gospel to these men and women. And three, adoption and foster education and support here in our community. So with those things that we are doing, and if you want more information on that, I have some information for you all at the back desk. So starting this ministry, how are ways that we can engage the church in this conversation? We had talked about this is a really hard conversation to have, and it's a hard conversation to start. So what are ways to engage the church in this kind of conversation?
Oh, I think I'm on. Okay. Yeah, this is a difficult conversation to have, right? I mean, thank you, Pastor, for having me here, because in reality, not every church has a sanctity of life speaker. Not every church would allow there to be a moms group that engages and equips women to get involved. And I truly believe we have to do this. There is no other sin within the church that we avoid quite like abortion. And I think it's because we don't want to hurt anyone. We don't want to offend anyone, right? And usually, and of course that comes from a very well-meaning place. But I think the other thing we need to recognize is that it comes from our own hurt, our own brokenness. If we haven't been impacted by an abortion personally in our lives, somebody else we know has. And so it makes it really, really hard to start having a conversation and getting involved. And so really, I think it's about just taking one step forward and being willing to have one conversation, right? I always joke, I think God made me a pretty good conversation starter, right? That's a pretty safe place to start, right? To just be like, man, I went to this service the other night and you're not going to believe this woman's story that I heard. It's a pretty safe way to start a conversation. And I think God gave me this really radical story to engage conversation of people who would not otherwise really want to take interest in it, right? I think he was very intentional with the different pieces of my life. So yeah, start that conversation. Just bring up church service, right? You have to be willing to just take one step. You're not going to get anywhere if you don't have the conversation. But always approach it with grace and love, right? Sometimes people come at me so aggressively, especially online, right? I know we all encounter this. But people will go after me so hard online. And when I respond back to them and say, you know what, thank you for your message. Could I talk to you about the things you said today? Can I tell you a little bit about what it's like to have lived this life? I've also lost a child through miscarriage. I have a child who has a lot of complex medical needs, right? I'm a medical needs mama. I live a really different kind of life than what people always know. And so when you actually start talking to someone to say, listen, can I tell you about some other things I know about? Or I understand what it's like to be in your shoes, to be scared, to experience suffering, right? When you join in that kind of common fellowship of humanity, it allows you to start having that conversation.
What are some of the biggest lies that you see this culture perpetuating, or just some of them? I know there are so many.
Like, Melissa's going to be here all night.
Or like, what are some that you personally deal with on a regular basis?
And it's not just lies, right? It's the avoidance of accurate information. We know statistically about coercion and force. We know that most abortions take place for what's called psychosocial reasons. So concerns about education, housing, employment, lack of social support, right? I mean, we are talking at like 90% plus. That's why most abortions take place. But what do we hear about in our society, right? We hear it's a choice, it's a right. We hear that it's a case of rape or incest. Those are a very small percentage of cases. So it's a lot of times that the truth is just simply covered. I think one of the worst lies, though, is that this is an issue of women's empowerment. You know, I was telling them tonight, when I say to people who say that, I say, what about my choice? What about my right? If I wouldn't have been allowed to live, there are no other rights for me. You can hear the crickets chirping. No one has anything to say to that.
That brings me to a really a good follow-up question is, when people do say in those small, and they are like 2% of all abortion cases are rape and incest cases, but when people do talk about that and they say it's the compassionate thing to do in rape or incest, even sometimes I hear the same argument for, well, they're going to grow up destitute. Right. How do you respond to that?
Who's going to care for all these children, right? The simple answer is ending the life of another human being should never be the solution to a problem, right? There is no other time in our society that we would say, you're going to be poor, probably kill them, right? You might be disabled, probably should end their life. A woman is going to face a difficulty, right? It makes no sense almost, right, when we start to break it down. So yeah, ending the life of a human being should never be the solution to a problem. But realize too, when people talk about those 1%, 2% of cases, it comes from a very well-meaning place, I think. We don't want to see anyone suffer, whether it's a child or a woman, right? Especially when there's been a rape, sexual assault, we don't want a woman to be further traumatized. But that's when we need to dig deep in our statistics and help share with people that women typically report that they find the abortion to be more traumatizing than the rape itself. You'll find story after story of women who say, my child was the only redemptive thing that came out of that situation, right? And we have to do better as a church coming alongside people who are in a difficult place of suffering.
Absolutely. So with that, too, how would you advise us as a church and as a new ministry of engaging those silent sufferers, both on those considering abortion, because abortion doesn't happen in a vacuum. Obviously, there are so many things that lead into that, so many emotional decisions as well. But those who are considering that because of horrible trauma that has happened to them, or those who have actually gone through with abortion that are here in the church and seeking that forgiveness, really.
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about this earlier. For me, it all comes down to relationship, right? We have to establish relationship with one another in order to bring about healing, to bring about change, to simply know what's going on in someone's life, right? And we live, I think, in a culture where it's so easy to just look past someone, right? We're all on our phones, we're all thinking about something else, and we miss the people who are right in front of our faces. So get off the phone. Have a conversation with someone. Ooh, God forbid, strike up a conversation with someone, right? I'm an introvert, believe it or not. So I have to make myself sometimes start that conversation. But it starts there. And establish relationships with people to then have the conversation about what you know to be truth about life and what resources are available to someone. People aren't going to necessarily trust you straight out of the gate if you don't have some sort of relationship.
I think that's something that we want to work on here, is that motherhood engagement portion of things is really making sure that we can connect to the mothers in this community, mothers, fathers too. I mean that making sure that we can communicate with them. And it's not just, we talked about this earlier, it's not just a one conversation, one and done, and you guys, you're saved now, go on your way. Helping them work through real pain with these things. So probably my last question. Yeah, I know. Just kind of broadening this subject too. I know we touched on the sanctity of all human life. When you see things like the March for Choice and a lot of the things that are happening in the new feminist wave that is happening in our country, how do you see that impacting our children in the culture when they see those things?
You saved a really easy question for the last. I think this is where it gets difficult for us as parents too, right? Because our children are sometimes watching things that we don't even know they're watching, right? And so they're privy to a lot of things. And I think, again, we have to be willing to have a conversation with our children and say, you know what, there was a march that happened on Friday that the media didn't report. By the way, there were a few 100,000 people there. And then there was another march the next day, right, with a very different meaning. And yes, I understand that what some of those concerns are. And definitely concerns are valid about the need for women to be safe and heard and understood, right? But at the same time, those two marches are very, very different in terms of how they value life and a lot of the messages that you see, right? And so for me, my daughters obviously are being raised to know that those are two very different marches and that I will march on those Fridays with 300,000 other people because I understand the dignity and value of every human life. But I want to someday go hand in hand with the people that march the next day to say, we're more alike than we are different. And I would love to have a conversation with you. I do that sometimes, right? I mean, I've had people from Planned Parenthood sitting right across from me testifying before bills. And I've gone up later and said, hi, I'm Melissa. And I go to shake their hand. And they've turned on their heel and walked away from me. But I will extend my hand time and time again. And maybe one of these times they will be willing to shake my hand. You have to be willing to reach out to the other side.